On a bitterly cold morning, January 1st, 1863, near Beatrice, Nebraska, a man named Daniel Freeman stood on 160 acres of virgin prairie. The grass reached above his waist, its roots tangled into a mat that had resisted fire, drought, and bison for 10,000 years. Freeman had arrived just after midnight to be first in line at the land office when the Homestead Act took effect. For $10 and a promise to live on this land for 5 years, the federal government would grant him title to this quarter section. But standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, Freeman faced a more immediate problem than the paperwork. The sod beneath his boots was so dense, so thoroughly reinforced by prairie grass roots, that settlers had learned to cut it into bricks and build houses from it. Breaking this land with the plows, Freeman knew from back east, would require teams of 20 oxen and 3 men working in brutal, back-breaking shifts. The mathematical reality was stark. A man with a walking plow and 2 horses could turn perhaps 1 acre per day if he could stand it. At that rate, clearing even 40 acres for planting would consume an entire season before a single seed went into the ground. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Freeman needed a revolution in metal and wheels. The story of how the Great Plains transformed from the Great American Desert into America's breadbasket centers on a deceptively simple machine called the Sulky Plow. Between 1862 and 1900, approximately 600,000 families claimed homesteads on the plains. Most failed. More than 1 million claims filed during the 19th century were abandoned without being proved up. But those who succeeded did so because of a confluence of technologies that arrived in the 1870s, and among these innovations, the Sulky Plow stands as perhaps the most critical. This was not a plow that merely improved upon existing tools. It was a riding plow with steel mold boards, 2 wheels, and a seat that allowed one operator to control 3 horses while turning a 14-inch or 16-inch furrow. Where a walking plow might break 1 to 2 acres per day, a skilled operator on a good sulky could turn 2 to 7 acres in the same time. That difference, measured across millions of acres and thousands of homesteads, meant the difference between agricultural empire and continued wilderness. The Sulky Plow did not make farming the plains easy. Nothing would ever make it easy. But it made farming the plains possible at the scale required to succeed. This is the story of how that machine arrived, who created it, what it cost, and how it fundamentally altered the ecology, economy, and human geography of the American West. The challenge Freeman and thousands like him confronted was a problem of biology meeting geology. The tall grass prairie east of the 100th meridian featured grasses with root systems extending 6 feet or more into the soil. The prairie sod was so densely matted that it formed what settlers called prairie marble, a layer so tough that wooden mold boards simply could not penetrate it without clogging with sticky black earth. The plains had been depicted through the 1850s as fundamentally unsuitable for agriculture. Multiple factors compounded this assessment. Annual precipitation declined sharply west of the 98th meridian. In Kansas, average annual precipitation ranged from 105 centimeters in the southeast to 40 centimeters in the southwest. The lack of trees meant no timber for building, no fuel for heating, and no fence posts for livestock control. Extreme temperature swings, from summer heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit to winter blizzards of appalling ferocity, created an environment unlike anything European agricultural tradition had prepared settlers to handle. Before any of the technologies that would eventually tame this landscape could function, the sod had to be broken. John Deere had addressed part of this problem in 1837 when he invented a steel plow with a polished mold board that could scour clean in prairie soil. Deere, working from his blacksmith shop in Grand Detour, Illinois, discovered that highly polished steel allowed the sticky Midwestern earth to slide off the blade rather than accumulating until the plow became useless. By 1838, Deere had built a house and established a forge. In 1839, he built 10 plows and sold them for $10 to $12 each. The mold board was patented in 1864, and by then Deere had moved his operations to Moline, Illinois, where he could access both the Mississippi River and the railroad. In 1863, Deere bought out his partners Robert Tate and John Gould. In 1868, he incorporated as Deere and Company. The steel plow solved the scouring problem, but it did not solve the problem of scale or the problem of human endurance. A walking plow required the operator to walk behind the implement, gripping 2 handles, guiding the blade while being dragged across uneven ground for 10 or 12 hours a day. The physical toll was immense. Many farmers literally could not stand the work. The plow itself, even made of steel, was only as effective as the team pulling it and the man guiding it, and both had limits. The first attempts to create riding plows had emerged as early as the 1840s, when ingenious farmers began attaching wheels and seats to plow assemblies. These early experiments made little progress into the 1860s. Multiple factors limited adoption. Many farmers reasoned that horses already labored under tremendous strain pulling the plow itself, and adding several hundred pounds of additional mechanism seemed counterproductive. More critically, many farmers were barely able to afford a walking plow, much less the more expensive sulky plow. In 1856, a man named M. Furley applied for what is recorded as the first patent for a single-bottom sulky plow. During the 1860s, several inventors received patents for wheeled riding plows, but these machines remained novelties until the 1870s, when the combination of mass production capacity, railroad distribution networks, and desperate demand from the enormous farms of Minnesota and the Dakotas created the conditions for sulky plows to become standard equipment. At a public field test of plows held in St. Louis in 1873, 16 sulky plows were entered in competition. The machines were no longer experimental oddities. They were becoming a recognized category of agricultural equipment. The man who would create what became known as the most successful sulky plow design was named Gilpin Moore. Born in Pennsylvania in 1831, Moore possessed both mechanical aptitude and practical farming knowledge. In 1864, the same year John Deere's mold board received its patent, Moore moved to Rock Island, Illinois, to work with Deere. By 1875, Moore had risen to superintendent of Deere's iron works. The timing was critical. The Homestead Act had been in effect for more than a decade. Settlers were streaming onto the plains. The railroads were spreading across Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota territory. The demand for equipment that could break prairie sod at scale was reaching a crisis point. Moore filed his patent application for a sulky plow on January 6, 1874. In his documentation, Moore noted that he had invented certain new and useful improvements in plows, specifically addressing the frog, which he formed from a single plate of wrought iron, bent to create both vertical and lateral support. On June 29, 1875, the United States Patent Office granted Moore's patent. The design featured an iron beam and frame with iron-bound wooden parts, making it exceptionally strong while remaining manageable for 3 horses to pull. The Gilpin Sulky Plow, as it came to be known, distinguished itself through several critical features. It operated with only one control lever, reducing the complexity that had plagued earlier designs. This single-lever system was easy on the operator and allowed for quick adjustments. The plow featured a new patent wheel with a chilled box, meaning the bearing surface was hardened through a rapid cooling process after casting. This chilled surface was nearly frictionless, reducing wear on the axle and allowing the bearing to be replaced at minimal cost. The plow could turn square corners without taking the blade out of the ground, a feature that judges at trials noted could save half an hour or more in plowing an acre. For farmers working from dawn to dusk, that half hour multiplied across an entire field represented the difference between finishing a section before winter or leaving land unplowed. The Gilpin featured 3 wheels. The large land wheel ran on unplowed ground and was considerably larger than the rear furrow wheel, which ran in the bottom of the previously turned furrow. The rear wheel was positioned just under the seat. The third wheel, slightly smaller, ran on the unplowed sod and featured inch-long studs, projecting from the rim to provide traction and prevent sideways drag from the plow's draft. In 1874, the Gilpin won the Grand Medal Award in field trials conducted by the Illinois State Board of Agriculture. In 1876, it won again at the Indiana State Board of Agriculture trials. By 1877, the Ohio farmer was advertising the Gilpin as the king of sulkies. The marketing was not empty hyperbole. An Iowa dealer wrote to Charles Deere, John Deere's son, who had taken over much of the company's operations, describing a trial at a county fair. The dealer had deliberately chosen difficult conditions to demonstrate the Gilpin's capabilities. The trial field contained smooth prairie, rough ground, and a section covered with weeds as high as a man's shoulders. To prove the plow's ease of operation, the dealer recruited a woman who had never operated a plow before to mount the Gilpin, while an experienced man ran a competing Crosley plow. The Gilpin buried the tall weeds entirely out of sight, leaving a clean furrow. The Crosley left weeds sticking out of the ground. The dealer reported the Gilpin's work was much better than any man could accomplish with any hand plow. In 1878, Charles Deere took a Gilpin to the Paris exhibition, where it won high honors alongside Deere's new gang plow, a multiple bottom implement designed for even larger operations. The success of the Gilpin drew immediate competition. In 1872, the newly established Missouri College of Agriculture conducted what may have been America's first systematic consumer testing of agricultural equipment. The post-Civil War years had seen factories that mass-produced cannons and rifles retooled to manufacture plows and threshers. Railroad expansion made shipment reliable and cheap. The printed catalog meant farmers no longer depended on local blacksmiths but could choose from hundreds of designs. But the explosion of choice created confusion. Advertising made every apparatus seem perfect. The Missouri tests, predating consumer reports by 70 years, sought to provide objective data. In trials conducted on both bluegrass sod and old bottom soil, multiple categories of plows competed. In the Sulky Plow division for bluegrass sod, the winner was the Starling, manufactured by Princeton Manufacturing Company of Princeton, Illinois. In old bottom soil, the Hughes Sulky Plow, made by Hughes Plow Company of St. Louis, took first place. The Hughes featured only 2 control levers and could turn square corners without removing the plow from the ground. Judges calculated this saved half an hour or more per acre. Multiple other manufacturers competed, including Moline Plow Company, B.F. Avery and Sons, and others whose names are now forgotten, but whose machines helped break millions of acres. But the Sulky Plow itself continued to evolve. In 1878, a young man named William P. Bettendorf, born July 1, 1857, working as a machinist's apprentice at Peru Plow Company in Peru, Illinois, invented the power-lift Sulky Plow. This innovation addressed one of the remaining points of physical strain in Sulky Plow operation. With earlier designs, at the end of each furrow, the farmer had to manually lift the plow blade from the earth before turning to start the next pass. Bettendorf's device allowed the operator to remain seated and simply press a lever to raise the plow. The improvement seems minor until one considers that a farmer might make this lifting motion hundreds of times in a single day. Over a season, the accumulated strain was debilitating. Most farm implement manufacturers rapidly adopted Bettendorf's powerlift design. The machine was becoming not just rideable, but genuinely controllable while seated. The Sulky Plow was approaching its mature form as a tool that allowed one person sitting on a machine to accomplish work that previously required multiple people in various states of physical exhaustion. The price of Sulky plows remained a significant barrier. While walking plows cost $10 to $12, Sulky plows were substantially more expensive. Contemporary accounts note that 6 walking plows were purchased for every 1 sulky plow, suggesting a price ratio of approximately 6 to 1. If walking plows cost $10, sulky plows likely sold for $60 or more, a sum representing multiple months of farm income for a homesteader just starting out. Many manufacturers offered an alternative, a sulky attachment consisting of wheels, axles, levers, and a seat that could convert a walking plow into a riding implement. This compromise reduced costs but sacrificed some of the integrated design advantages of purpose-built sulky plows. Nevertheless, the attachment market suggests how desperately farmers wanted to escape the walking plow's physical demands. Farmers who could afford it bought sulky plows outright. Those who could not bought attachments. Those who could afford neither continued to walk, their bodies bent and aching, behind teams that could barely keep moving by mid-afternoon. The economics of the sulky plow were brutal in their clarity. The machine cost more money up front, but could plow 2 to 7 times more land per day. For farmers operating on the margin, that efficiency multiplier could mean the difference between proving up a claim and abandoning it. As sulky plows proliferated, they began appearing in specialized configurations. The Oliver Company of South Bend, Indiana, became particularly prominent. The Oliver Sulky was built so robustly that the name became generic. Farmers simply referred to the Oliver the way later generations would refer to the Jeep. James Oliver had spent years experimenting with chilled metal, a process where the casting was drenched in cold water immediately after pouring to increase hardness. The resulting plow moldboard was marketed as capable of scouring in any soil and lasting a lifetime. The Oliver No. 23B, a reversible sulky plow, manufactured from approximately 1917 through 1934, represented the pinnacle of the technology. This machine could be set to turn soil to either the left or the right, allowing highly efficient plowing patterns that minimized the time horses and operators spent walking back to start positions. The reversible sulky weighed about 550 pounds and required 3 horses. Many authorities would later consider this machine the apex of horse-drawn plow design, the final refinement before tractors rendered the entire category obsolete. But between 1875 and 1920, the sulky plow in its various incarnations was the dominant technology for breaking prairie sod and maintaining cropland across the entire Great Plains. The scale at which sulky plows operated becomes visible in the agricultural statistics. In 1879, 12 million acres of crops were harvested across the Great Plains. 20 years later, in 1899, that figure had grown to 54 million acres. By 1919, 88 million acres were under cultivation. The peak came in 1929 with 103 million acres harvested. This expansion, from 12 million to 103 million acres in 50 years, represents one of the most rapid and complete ecological transformations in human history. Every acre of that expansion required breaking sod. In 1879, with primarily walking plows, farmers managed 12 million acres. The introduction and rapid adoption of sulky plows in the 1880s and 1890s directly enabled the explosive growth to 54 million acres by 1899. The technology arrived precisely when it was needed. Homesteaders were flooding onto the plains. The railroads had reached Kansas City, Omaha, and Cheyenne. Grain elevators were being constructed to store and ship harvests. The market infrastructure existed. What remained was the physical labor of breaking ground, and sulky plows made that labor possible at the necessary scale. Kansas provides a vivid case study. In 1883, Kansas produced 150 million bushels of corn. The state had been known primarily as corn country, but the introduction of Turkey red wheat by German Mennonites from southern Russia in the early 1870s was rapidly changing that identity. Turkey Red was a hard winter wheat variety, ideally suited to the Kansas climate. It could be planted in the fall, overwinter in the ground, and grow rapidly in spring before summer drought arrived. Within 2 decades, Kansas transformed into a wheat state, and that transformation depended on breaking vastly more sod than had previously been cultivated. Wheat production across the United States grew from 85 million bushels in 1839 to 500 million bushels in 1880, and 600 million bushels by 1900. The Great Plains accounted for the vast majority of that increase. In 1880, 150 million bushels of American wheat were exported, worth $190 million, making the United States a dominant player in global grain markets. That export economy depended on plains farmers breaking enough land to produce a massive surplus. They could not have done so with walking plows alone. The Sulky Plow's adoption pattern was not uniform. The huge farms of Minnesota and the Dakotas, desperate for something more efficient than walking plows, were quick to adopt 14-inch and 16-inch riding Sulky plows during the 1860s and 1870s. These operations often had dozens of Sulky plows working simultaneously, with hired crews operating them in shifts. The Bonanza Farms of the Dakotas, massive operations funded by Eastern capital, deployed industrial-scale agriculture. By 1895, one Bonanza Farm operation reported that 6 people and 36 horses, pulling huge harvesters, working 10-hour days, could produce 20,000 bushels of wheat. For comparison, in 1830, 4 people and 2 oxen working 10-hour days produced 200 bushels. The productivity increase was 100-fold in 65 years, and the Sulky Plow was a critical link in that transformation. Smaller homesteaders, working quarter sections with family labor, adopted Sulky plows more gradually as they accumulated capital and as prices eventually declined due to competition among manufacturers. By the 1890s, Sulky plows had become standard equipment for anyone farming more than 80 acres. The physical experience of operating a Sulky plow was far from comfortable. The operator sat in what was essentially an iron basket with no springs, enduring every rock, rut, and clod transmitted directly through the steel frame. Many plowmen walked behind their Sulky plows periodically throughout the day, just to straighten their backs and restore circulation. A cured sheepskin tied to the seat provided the only cushioning available. The work remained grueling. Operating the single lever to adjust furrow depth and width required constant attention. Maintaining straight furrows, which was the mark of a skilled plowman and essential for efficient planting, demanded intense concentration. Turning at the end of each pass, adjusting the wheels and mold board angle, managing 3 horses, monitoring for rocks or stumps that could damage the blade. All of this occurred while the operator was being shaken continuously on a metal seat moving at walking speed across rough ground. The Sulky Plow eliminated the need to walk, but it did not eliminate the difficulty of the work. What it eliminated was the absolute physical impossibility of breaking enough land to make homesteading viable. The technology did not spread in isolation. The Homestead Act of May 20, 1862, created the legal framework. The act granted 160 acres to any adult citizen or intended citizen who paid a small filing fee and agreed to live on the land and improve it for 5 years. Between 1862 and 1976, more than 270 million acres were distributed under various Homestead Acts. Approximately 4 million claims were filed, though only about 1.6 million were ultimately proved up, meaning roughly 50% of homesteaders failed. The act took effect on January 1, 1863. Daniel Freeman's claim near Beatrice, Nebraska, made just after midnight that day, established him as arguably the first homesteader. By 1900, approximately 600,000 families had claimed homesteads. The peak year was 1913, when the highest total acreage was claimed. Most homesteading occurred between 1900 and 1930, meaning the majority of homestead claims coincided with the mature availability of sulky plows and other agricultural technologies. The 160 acres granted by the Homestead Act, ample in the humid east, proved barely adequate on the dry plains. In 1909, the enlarged Homestead Act increased the allotment to 320 acres in recognition that dry land farming required more land per family. Barbed wire, developed commercially in the 1870s, provided essential fencing in a region without timber. Joseph Glidden of DeKalb, Illinois, is credited with the key patents. Barbed wire made it possible to fence millions of acres quickly and cheaply, protecting crops from free-ranging cattle and defining property boundaries. Windmills, another critical innovation, allowed farmers to pump water from deep wells at remote locations, solving the water supply problem that had previously limited settlement. The railroads constructed across the plains during the 1870s provided the transportation network necessary to ship grain to eastern and international markets. All of these technologies were necessary. None alone was sufficient. The Sulky Plow fit into this suite of innovations as the tool that made the primary labor, breaking and plowing land, possible at the required scale. Without sulky plows, even homesteaders with barbed wire fences, windmill-fed wells, and railroad access would have failed because they simply could not have broken enough land to produce crops sufficient to sustain themselves and generate income. The environmental consequences of this transformation have been measured and debated for generations. The prairie ecosystem that had evolved over 10,000 years was fundamentally and irreversibly altered in less than 50 years. The buffalo herds, which numbered in the tens of millions in 1870, were systematically exterminated by 1880. The prairie grasses, with their deep root systems that prevented erosion and retained moisture, were plowed under and replaced with annual crops that left soil exposed to wind and rain. The immediate effect was an agricultural boom. Corn and wheat harvests soared. Land values increased. Towns and cities sprouted across the plains. But the long-term ecological consequences became apparent during the droughts of the 1890s and catastrophically during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The same sulky plows that broke the prairie sod also broke the ecological systems that had made the prairie stable. In 1879, 12 million acres were under cultivation. By 1929, 103 million acres had been plowed. The topsoil that had accumulated over millennia began to erode. When the droughts came, the wind carried away millions of tons of soil. The plow that broke the plains also, in a very real sense, broke them. Historians have grappled with the meaning of this transformation. Walter Prescott Webb, in his influential 1931 book, The Great Plains, argued that the environmental conditions of the plains forced adaptations in technology, law, and social organization. Webb identified the steel plow, barbed wire, and the windmill as the three key technological innovations that made plains settlement possible. Later scholars, including Donald Worster, examined the economic and environmental costs of that settlement. Worster's concept of the tragedy of the laissez-faire commons suggested that market forces driven by profit maximization inevitably led to environmental degradation. Unregulated agriculture, incentivized by rising grain prices and land speculation, encouraged farmers to plow marginal land that should have remained in grass. The sulky plow, in this analysis, was not merely a tool but an agent of ecological destruction operating at the service of capitalist expansion. The counter-argument emphasizes that the plains today produce a significant portion of the world's food supply and that modern conservation practices have mitigated some of the worst excesses of early settlement. The debate remains unresolved. The human cost must also be reckoned. The Homestead Act and the agricultural settlement it enabled came at the direct expense of native peoples. The plains had been home to numerous tribes, including the Kiowas, Missouris, Pawnees, Comanches, Crees, Arikaras, Assiniboines, Crows, Mandans, and Tetons. These peoples had developed sophisticated horse cultures adapted to the plains environment. Between 1862 and 1890, these tribes were systematically dispossessed of their lands and forced onto reservations. The land that Daniel Freeman claimed on January 1st, 1863, was ceded territory. The 270 million acres distributed under the Homestead Act were not empty wilderness, but ancestral lands taken through conquest and coerced treaties. The plow that broke the sod also broke the indigenous societies that had inhabited those lands for centuries. The economic opportunity that homesteading represented for white settlers came directly from the destruction of native sovereignty and the seizure of native land. This reality does not diminish the genuine hardship that homesteaders endured: the backbreaking labor, the crop failures, the isolation, the brutal climate. But it contextualizes that hardship within a larger pattern of dispossession and violence. For those who succeeded, the rewards could be substantial. Homesteaders who proved up their claims gained title to land that would have been prohibitively expensive in the East. Some of these families established agricultural dynasties that persist today. The descendants of homesteaders now number approximately 93 million Americans. But success required capital that many homesteaders did not possess. The land was free, but the equipment, livestock, seed, and supplies were not. A homesteader needed a plow, a wagon, horses or oxen, seed for planting, tools for building a dwelling, and sufficient provisions to survive until the first harvest. Contemporary estimates suggested a homesteader needed at least $300 to $500 in capital to establish a viable farm. Many arrived with far less. They borrowed money at punishing interest rates, mortgaging their land before they even received title. When drought struck in 1884, 1894, and again in the 1930s, heavily indebted farmers lost everything. The fortunate timing of good weather and good grain prices could mean prosperity. The misfortune of drought or price collapse meant ruin. The Sulky Plow increased the odds of success by making it physically possible to cultivate enough land to generate surplus income, but it could not guarantee success. The social structure of plains agriculture was shaped by the technology. Small-scale homesteaders typically owned one Sulky Plow and operated it themselves with family labor. They cultivated their 160 acres, or after 1909, their 320 acres, planted wheat or corn or both, and hoped for adequate rain and decent prices. Larger operations, the bonanza farms and commercial enterprises funded by outside capital, deployed multiple Sulky Plows and gang plows, hired seasonal labor for planting and harvest, and operated on a fundamentally different economic model. These operations purchased the most advanced equipment, including eventually the gang plows that featured 2 or more bottoms and could turn multiple furrows simultaneously. The gang plow, which emerged in the 1870s by adding additional bottoms to Sulky Plow frames, represented the next step in mechanization. A 2-bottom gang plow could turn 2 14-inch furrows simultaneously, effectively doubling output. 3-bottom and 4-bottom gang plows followed. The progression from walking plow to Sulky Plow to gang plow to, eventually, tractor-drawn plows represented a steady march toward greater scale and efficiency, each step requiring more capital and favoring larger operations. By 1900, the patterns were set. The Great Plains had transitioned from open range to fenced farmland. The cattle ranching that had dominated the early settlement period had been pushed to the western margins or confined to fenced operations. The open range economy collapsed in the late 1880s due to overgrazing, competition from Midwestern beef production, a slipping national economy, and the disastrous winter of 1887 to 1888, when massive snowstorms and temperatures far below zero killed hundreds of thousands of cattle. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was so severe it effectively ended open-range ranching as an economic model. The rapid influx of homesteaders onto the plains during the 1880s, each one fencing property with barbed wire and plowing land that had previously been open range, made the old cattle operations unviable. The future of the plains was agriculture, and agriculture depended on the plow. By the early 1900s, the Great Plains were producing grain not just for American consumption, but for export to global markets. American wheat fed Europe, and the surplus production that made that export possible was the direct result of the mechanization of prairie farming. The Sulky Plow remained the dominant technology for breaking and plowing land through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The gasoline tractor arrived in the 1910s and began to displace horse-drawn equipment, but the transition was gradual. Early tractors were expensive, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to operate. Many farmers continued using horses and sulky plows well into the 1930s. The Fordson tractor, one of the first mass-produced tractors, could turn 6 acres a day compared to the 2 acres typical of a sulky plow. But the Fordson cost far more than a sulky plow, required fuel and mechanical maintenance, and was useless if it broke down. Horses could be repaired with time and feed. A broken tractor required parts and specialized knowledge. The economic calculation was complex. Eventually, tractors won, but the victory took decades. During that transition period, both technologies coexisted. Farmers who could afford tractors bought them for the heaviest work, but kept horses and sulky plows for smaller fields, tight corners, and backup. The sulky plow's long dominance testifies to how well the technology was adapted to its purpose. It was not perfect, it was not easy, but it worked. It worked reliably, at a scale sufficient to transform a continent, operated by people whose survival depended on its function. The archaeological record of this transformation is visible in the land itself. Soil scientists can identify plow scars in subsurface layers, revealing the depth and orientation of 19th century plowing. Museum collections across the plains hold hundreds of examples of sulky plows in various states of preservation. The Gilpin Sulky Plow that sold at auction for $11,000 in 2006 testifies to the historical value collectors place on these machines. But the real legacy is in the agricultural landscape. The fields that stretch to the horizon across Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and Montana were created, acre by acre, by farmers operating sulky plows. The scale is difficult to comprehend. 103 million acres plowed by 1929. Each acre required multiple passes of the plow over multiple years. The accumulated labor, the millions of man-hours and horse-hours, the countless tons of sod turned and pulverized and leveled, represent one of the greatest collective efforts in American history. It was not undertaken for glory or national purpose. It was undertaken by individual families trying to establish farms and build futures. But the aggregate result reshaped the nation. The question of what might have been had the sulky plow not been invented or not been affordable invites speculation. Would the Great Plains have remained largely unsettled? Would homesteading have proceeded more slowly, limiting the number of successful claims and leaving more land in grass? Would different crops have been cultivated, ones requiring less intensive soil preparation? The historical record suggests that the settlement wave was driven by multiple powerful forces. The federal government actively promoted westward expansion. The railroads needed customers and cargo. Land speculators sought profits. European immigrants sought opportunity. The pressure to settle the plains would have existed regardless of plow technology. But technology sets limits on what is possible. The walking plow could not break prairie sod at sufficient scale to support the homesteading model. The sulky plow could. That difference determined whether the Homestead Act succeeded or failed as a settlement program. The political will existed. The legal framework existed. The transportation infrastructure was being built. What remained was the physical capability to transform grass into farmland, and the Sulky Plow provided that capability. History turned on that capacity. The manufacturers who produced these machines were themselves transformed by the market they served. John Deere and Company became one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in the world, a position it still holds. The company's success was built on the foundation of the steel plow and the Gilpin Sulky Plow. Competitors like Oliver, Moline, Parlin, and Orendorff, and others grew into substantial enterprises by supplying the seemingly insatiable demand for plows. The agricultural implement industry became a major sector of American manufacturing. The consolidation and specialization that occurred within this industry mirrored broader patterns in American industrialization. Small blacksmith shops that had once made plows to order were displaced by factories producing thousands of identical units. Standardization allowed interchangeable parts, which lowered costs and simplified repairs. The economies of scale achieved by mass production brought prices down over time, gradually making Sulky plows affordable to a broader range of farmers. By 1910, the Sulky plow had transitioned from expensive innovation to standard equipment. That transition marked the moment when the technology had fully accomplished its purpose. The infrastructure required to support this agricultural transformation extended far beyond the plow itself. The grain elevator system, which emerged in the 1870s and 1880s, provided the storage and shipping capacity necessary to move harvests from individual farms to regional markets and eventually to international ports. These massive, wooden structures rising above the flat plains landscape like cathedrals of commerce represented capital investments that matched or exceeded the value of the plows that filled them with grain. A typical country elevator could store tens of thousands of bushels. The largest terminal elevators in cities like Kansas City, Minneapolis, and Chicago could hold millions of bushels. The elevator system operated on credit and futures contracts, allowing farmers to sell grain for cash or store it for later sale when prices might improve. This financial infrastructure was as necessary as the physical infrastructure. Farmers needed operating capital to purchase seed, equipment, and supplies for the next season. The elevator system provided that capital through advances against stored grain. Without elevators, the Sulky plow's increased productivity would have been meaningless because farmers would have had no way to store or sell their surplus production. The railroad companies understood this interconnection and actively promoted both settlement and agricultural equipment adoption. Railroad land departments employed agents who traveled through Europe recruiting immigrants with promises of cheap land and agricultural opportunity. The railroads owned vast tracts of land granted by the federal government as incentives for construction. These land grants, totaling millions of acres, needed to be sold to generate revenue and create customers who would ship grain on the railroads. The land agents worked in concert with agricultural equipment dealers. A typical promotional package included reduced price land, discounted rail passage for the immigrant family, and financing arrangements for purchasing equipment, including plows. The system was designed to create farmers who would generate freight traffic. The railroads succeeded spectacularly. By 1890, the Great Plains were crisscrossed with rail lines, grain elevators dotted every town, and millions of acres of wheat and corn were moving to market. The Sulky plow was a component in this system, the tool that made the primary production possible, but its effectiveness depended on every other component functioning as well. The market for agricultural equipment became intensely competitive in the 1880s and 1890s. Dozens of manufacturers produced plows, each claiming superior design and performance. The 1872 Missouri plow trials established a precedent for comparative testing, and similar events were held across the Midwest. County fairs and state agricultural exhibitions featured plow demonstrations that drew large crowds of farmers evaluating potential purchases. These demonstrations were carefully staged. Manufacturers selected the best operators, the finest horse teams, and the most favorable soil conditions. But farmers, skilled in evaluating tools and understanding soil, could often see through the marketing to assess actual performance. The reputation a plow earned in field demonstrations could make or break a manufacturer. The Gilpin's success in trials from 1874 through the late 1880s established Deere and Company's dominance in the market. Competitors constantly innovated, trying to develop features that would give them an advantage. The result was steady incremental improvement across the industry. Plows became lighter, stronger, easier to adjust, and more durable. The competition drove innovation that benefited farmers, even as it bankrupted manufacturers who could not keep pace. The seasonal rhythm of plains agriculture created distinctive labor patterns that the Sulky Plow both enabled and intensified. Spring plowing began as soon as the ground thawed enough to work, typically March or April depending on latitude. Farmers raced to prepare fields for planting, knowing that delays could mean crops failing to mature before fall frost. The Sulky Plow's efficiency allowed farmers to prepare more acres in the critical planting window, but it also meant that farmers who could afford Sulky Plows planted more acres, which meant more work at harvest time. The harvest labor crisis became acute in the 1880s and 1890s as acreage expanded faster than the local labor supply. Migrant harvest crews following the wheat harvest north from Texas through the Dakotas became a permanent feature of plains agriculture. These workers, often recent immigrants or men down on their luck, lived rough, worked brutal hours during harvest season, and then scattered to find work elsewhere during the off-season. The mechanization that the Sulky Plow represented paradoxically increased the demand for seasonal labor because it allowed individual farmers to cultivate areas too large to harvest with family labor alone. The social structure of plains agriculture became bifurcated between land-owning farmers and landless laborers, a division that the mechanization of plowing had helped create. The physical demands on horses in Sulky Plow operations were substantial. 3 horses pulling a 14-inch or 16-inch plow through prairie sod or even established cropland worked at near maximum capacity. The typical workday was 10 to 12 hours with brief rest periods. Horses required vast amount of feed, particularly oats and hay. A working horse consumed 10 to 20 pounds of oats daily plus equivalent amounts of hay. 3 horses thus consumed 30 to 60 pounds of oats per day. Over a plowing season of several months, the feed costs were considerable. Farmers grew oats and hay for their own horses when possible. But in the early years of settlement, before feed crops were established, purchasing horse feed represented a significant expense. The care of horses required knowledge and labor. Harnesses had to be maintained, adjusted, and repaired. Horses needed to be shod, a task requiring a skilled blacksmith. Veterinary problems, common with hard-working animals, could sideline a farming operation. The horse-powered agriculture that Sulky Plows enabled was a complex system where mechanical innovation remained utterly dependent on biological capacity. The transition to tractors, when it finally came, eliminated the horse care burden but created new dependencies on fuel supply and mechanical maintenance. The weather patterns of the Great Plains imposed dramatic constraints on agricultural success, regardless of plow technology. The region experienced cycles of wet and dry years that could span a decade or more. The 1880s began with unusually favorable rainfall, which encouraged a flood of settlement. Promotional literature promised "rain follows the plow," a theory that plowing and cultivating soil would increase regional precipitation through evaporation. This pseudo-scientific notion was promoted by railroad companies, land speculators, and even some university professors. It was, of course, entirely false. When the inevitable drought cycle returned in the late 1880s and particularly in the 1890s, farmers who had expanded cultivation during wet years faced catastrophe. Wheat crops failed. Corn withered. Wells went dry. The drought of the 1890s drove an exodus from the plains, comparable in scale to the influx of the previous decade. Entire counties depopulated. Abandoned homesteads dotted the landscape, their sod houses gradually eroding back into the earth from which they had been cut. The survivors were those with sufficient capital reserves to endure multiple failed seasons, or those fortunate enough to have land in areas where rainfall remained adequate. The sulky plow could break ground efficiently, but it could not make rain. The fundamental limits of plains agriculture were climatic, not technological. The populist movement of the 1890s emerged directly from the agricultural crisis. Farmers, heavily indebted and facing ruinous grain prices, driven down by oversupply and manipulation by railroad and grain elevator companies, organized politically to demand government intervention. The Populist Party platform called for railroad regulation, currency inflation to ease debt burdens, and cooperative ownership of grain elevators. The movement represented farmers' recognition that technological solutions alone could not address the systemic economic pressures they faced. A sulky plow might double plowing efficiency, but if grain prices fell by more than half, the farmer was worse off than before. The economic mathematics of agriculture on the plains created a treadmill where technological advancement increased production. Increased production drove down prices. Lower prices forced farmers to cultivate more acres to maintain income, and more cultivation required more technology investment. The cycle benefited equipment manufacturers, railroads, and grain merchants while keeping farmers perpetually indebted and vulnerable. The political response, though ultimately unsuccessful in its most radical demands, established patterns of agricultural policy and farm subsidies that would persist into the 20th century. The question of who benefited most from plains settlement and the sulky plow's role in that settlement has no simple answer. Homesteaders who succeeded acquired land and established farms that provided livelihoods for generations. Some prospered considerably. The average successful homesteader achieved modest financial security, which represented a significant improvement over their prior circumstances. Equipment manufacturers profited substantially. John Deere and Company's growth from a small blacksmith operation to a major corporation generated wealth for investors and employment for thousands of workers. Railroad companies benefited from freight traffic and land sales. Grain merchants and elevator companies captured value through their control of marketing channels. The national economy benefited from increased food production and export revenues, but these benefits came at documented costs. Native peoples were dispossessed and confined to reservations where poverty and hardship became endemic. Failed homesteaders, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, lost their labor, savings, and often their health to an agricultural system that proved economically unviable for roughly half of all participants. The ecological transformation, while initially productive, set conditions for the Dust Bowl that would devastate the region in the 1930s. The accounting is complex, and different perspectives yield different conclusions about whether the transformation the sulky plow enabled was worth its costs. The gender dynamics of plains agriculture deserve examination. The Homestead Act was unusual for its time in allowing single women and widows to claim land. Several thousand women did so successfully. Women's labor was essential on homestead farms, regardless of who held title. Women managed households, raised children, tended gardens, preserved food, cared for livestock, and often worked in the fields during critical periods like harvest. The physical demands were extraordinary. Water had to be carried from wells, often considerable distances. Cooking was done on wood or coal stoves that required constant fuel supply and fire management. Laundry was done by hand. The isolation of homestead life, with neighbors often miles away and towns hours distant by wagon, imposed psychological costs documented in settlers' diaries and letters. Women's testimonies from the period describe loneliness, exhaustion, anxiety about children's health and safety, and the grinding relentlessness of work. The sulky plow changed men's labor by allowing them to plow more acres while seated rather than walking, but it had no comparable impact on women's work, which remained largely unmechanized until the 20th century. The asymmetry meant that mechanization of field work increased household labor burden proportionally as farms grew larger. More acres meant more meals to prepare for harvest crews, more garden produce to preserve, more income accounting to manage. The transformation of plains agriculture created specific hardships for women that deserve recognition alongside the broader narrative of settlement. Children's labor was similarly essential and similarly arduous. Farm children began working at young ages, typically by age 7 or 8, performing tasks like feeding chickens, collecting eggs, and bringing water to field workers. By age 12, children were often operating plows, driving wagons, and performing essentially adult labor. The physical risks were considerable. Children were injured by farm machinery, kicked by horses, and exposed to harsh weather conditions. The educational consequences were significant. Rural schools operated on schedules that accommodated agricultural labor demands, closing during planting and harvest. Many children received only rudimentary education, attending irregularly when farm work permitted. The cycle of agricultural labor perpetuated itself as children who grew up on farms had few options beyond farming, lacking the education for other occupations. The sulky plow, by enabling larger farm operations, increased the labor demands on family members, including children. The agricultural transformation that it facilitated was built in part on child labor that later generations would recognize as exploitation. The technical evolution of the plow continued beyond the sulky. Gang plows, which featured 2 or more bottoms operating simultaneously, emerged in the 1870s and became common in the 1880s and 1890s. A 2-bottom gang plow could turn 2 14-inch furrows at once, effectively doubling output compared to a sulky. But gang plows required 4 or more horses and were correspondingly more expensive. They were economically viable only on larger operations. The progression from walking plow to sulky to gang plow to tractor-drawn plow represented a steady march toward greater scale and capital intensity. Each technological step favored larger operations that could afford the equipment and had sufficient acreage to justify the investment. The result was gradual consolidation, with successful farmers acquiring land from failed neighbors and assembling operations of several hundred or even 1,000 acres. This consolidation trend, visible by 1900 and accelerating through the 20th century, transformed the plains from a region of family homesteads to one increasingly dominated by larger commercial operations. The sulky plow was an intermediate technology in this progression, more efficient than what came before, less efficient than what came after, but critical during the period when the fundamental transformation from grassland to farmland occurred. The spatial organization of plains agriculture reflected both the rectangular survey system and the practical limitations of horse-powered farming. The Homestead Act's quarters section of 160 acres derived from the survey system, which divided land into 6-mile square townships, each containing 36 1-mile square sections of 640 acres. A quarter section was 1/2 mile by 1/2 mile. This geometric regularity, imposed on the irregular topography of the actual landscape, created the characteristic checkerboard pattern visible in aerial views of the plains. But the spatial organization also reflected practical considerations. A farmer working from a central homestead could efficiently cultivate land within a radius of approximately 1 mile. Beyond that distance, the time required to travel to and from fields reduced productivity significantly. A quarter section fit within this radius. A full section would have required a farm layout where the homestead sat near one edge, with fields extending beyond efficient working distance. The mechanization of plowing with sulky plows increased the acreage one person could work, but did not change the basic spatial constraint. The result was a settlement pattern of dispersed individual farmsteads rather than agricultural villages, surrounded by fields, as was common in European tradition. This dispersion created social isolation that characterized plains life and distinguished it from agricultural regions where farmers lived in villages. The Sulky Plow story is inseparable from the broader story of American expansion, industrialization, and agricultural capitalism. The machine did not exist in isolation. It was part of a system that included land policy, transportation infrastructure, market networks, and immigrant labor. But within that system, the Sulky Plow occupied a critical position. It was the tool that made possible the fundamental transformation the system required. Policy could grant land, railroads could transport grain, markets could provide demand. But someone had to break the sod, and the Sulky Plow was the machine that made that breaking possible at the necessary scale. To understand the Great Plains today, to understand how the region transitioned from grassland to agricultural powerhouse, requires understanding this machine. It was not the only factor. It was not even the most important factor in isolation. But it was a necessary factor. And at the moment when settlement accelerated, the Sulky Plow provided the mechanical capability that allowed human ambition to reshape an entire ecosystem. We began with Daniel Freeman standing on virgin prairie on January 4, 1863, confronting the problem of scale. Freeman did eventually prove up his claim. He broke the land, built a dwelling, survived 5 years, and received title to his 160 acres. He used a plow, almost certainly a walking plow initially because sulky plows had not yet become widely available, and the work nearly killed him. But Freeman succeeded, and his homestead is preserved today as part of Homestead National Historical Park near Beatrice, Nebraska, where visitors can learn about the homesteading experience and the pioneers who settled the plains. By 1875, when Gilpin Moore received his patent for the Sulky Plow, thousands of farmers like Freeman were confronting the same arithmetic. 160 acres, 2 acres per day with a walking plow. The numbers did not work. The Sulky Plow changed the numbers. 2 to 7 acres per day. That new arithmetic made homesteading viable. The difference, measured in acres per day, meant the difference between success and failure for the homesteading program, between settlement and abandonment of the plains, between agricultural empire and continued grassland. The machine itself was simple, almost crude by modern standards. 3 wheels, a steel mold board, an iron frame, a seat, a lever. But the impact of that simple machine exceeded anything its inventors might have imagined. It broke the plains, and in breaking them, it made modern America possible. The cultural memory of this transformation has been shaped by multiple narratives, some celebrating pioneer achievement and others emphasizing displacement and environmental destruction. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books, written in the 1930s and 1940s but set in the homesteading period, helped establish a narrative of frontier self-reliance and family perseverance that resonated with generations of readers. Wilder's father, Charles Ingalls, was himself a homesteader who filed claims in Kansas and Dakota Territory. Her depictions of sod houses, prairie fires, grasshopper plagues, and the grinding labor of farm life have shaped popular understanding of the homesteading experience. But Wilder's narratives, while capturing genuine hardship, largely elided the dispossession of native peoples and presented settlement as inevitable progress rather than contested conquest. More recent historical work has attempted to complicate this narrative, restoring indigenous perspectives and examining the environmental consequences of agricultural expansion. The Sulky Plow appears in both narratives, celebrated in one as the tool that made settlement possible, critiqued in the other as an implement of ecological destruction. Both perspectives contain truth. The technology enabled transformation. Whether that transformation was worth its costs remains a question without consensus. The material legacy of the Sulky Plow era persists in the landscape. The rectangular field patterns, the section-line roads that run ruler straight across the plains, the scattered farmsteads each sitting on its quarter section, all reflect decisions made in the 1860s through 1890s when the land was first surveyed and settled. Many of these farms remain in operation, though often consolidated into larger holdings. The descendants of homesteaders still farm portions of the same land their ancestors broke with sulky plows. The equipment itself has largely disappeared from active use, relegated to museums and private collections. But the fields those plows created continue to produce wheat and corn. The infrastructure built to serve sulky plow agriculture, the grain, elevators, the rail lines, the rural road networks, remains essential to contemporary operations. The economic and social patterns established during the sulky plow era have proven remarkably persistent. The plains remain an agricultural region, characterized by relatively low population density, dispersed settlement, and economies dependent on grain production. The transformation that the sulky plow enabled was fundamental and, at least in its broad outlines, permanent. The technological lineage from sulky plow to modern equipment is direct. The basic principle of the moldboard plow, using a curved steel surface to turn soil, persists in contemporary designs. The shift to tractor power in the 1920s through 1940s replaced horses but did not fundamentally alter the implement. Modern tractor-drawn plows are recognizably descendants of sulky plows, scaled larger and equipped with hydraulic controls, but operating on the same fundamental mechanics. The transition to no-till agriculture in recent decades, driven by concerns about soil conservation and erosion, represents the first major departure from the plowing tradition. No-till systems plant seeds directly into crop residue without plowing, preserving soil structure and reducing erosion. This approach addresses some of the environmental damage caused by a century of intensive plowing. But no-till adoption remains incomplete, and much plains agriculture still involves annual plowing. The sulky plow's legacy continues in the fields that are turned each spring, preparing for another season of wheat or corn. The economic analysis of the sulky plow's impact involves counterfactuals that are impossible to prove but instructive to consider. Without the sulky plow or a similar efficiency improvement in soil preparation, would the Great Plains have been settled at the pace and scale that actually occurred? The pressure for westward expansion existed regardless of technology. The federal government's commitment to distributing public lands was established policy. The railroad companies' need for freight traffic created powerful incentives to promote settlement. Immigrant populations seeking land and opportunity would have come regardless. But technology sets boundaries on what is possible. The walking plow could not break prairie sod fast enough to make homesteading economically viable for most settlers on the timeline the historical record shows. The sulky plow removed that constraint. The alternative scenario, where the plains remained largely unsettled until later mechanization or different agricultural approaches, would have produced a fundamentally different American West. The timing mattered. The confluence of the Homestead Act, railroad expansion, immigrant availability, and sulky plow adoption created a specific historical moment when rapid transformation became possible. Alter any of these factors significantly, and the outcome changes. The international dimension of this story deserves mention. American wheat exports, made possible by plains production, disrupted global agricultural markets. British farmers, unable to compete with cheap American wheat, faced economic crisis in the late 19th century. European agriculture generally struggled to compete with the scale and efficiency of New World production. The sulky plow and the agricultural system it enabled contributed to a fundamental shift in global food production patterns, moving the center of grain production from Europe to North America. This shift had geopolitical implications, making European nations dependent on American agricultural exports and creating economic leverage that shaped international relations. The strategic importance of food security became apparent during World War I, when American grain exports were critical to feeding Allied nations. The agricultural capacity that Sulky Plows helped create in the 1870s and 1880s proved strategically crucial 40 years later. History operates on long timelines, and the consequences of technological choices ripple forward in ways contemporaries cannot fully anticipate. The preservation of sulky plows and other historical agricultural equipment has become a focus for museums and collectors across the plains. These institutions recognize that the physical artifacts of agricultural transformation deserve preservation alongside the documentary record. A sulky plow sitting in a museum provides a tangible connection to the past that no photograph or written account can fully convey. The weight of the iron, the curve of the mold board, the worn handles and seats that show evidence of decades of use. These details communicate the physical reality of the work in ways that words struggle to capture. Museum interpreters use these artifacts to help contemporary visitors understand the labor that shaped the landscape they see outside. The educational value is considerable. Children who grow up in a world of combine harvesters and GPS-guided tractors need to understand that the agricultural abundance they take for granted was created by people working with the horses and simple steel implements. That understanding fosters appreciation for both historical achievement and contemporary privilege. The Sulky Plow's story is ultimately a story about scale and what happens when human capability suddenly expands. The technology multiplied plowing efficiency by a factor of 3 to 7. That multiplication, applied across millions of acres and thousands of farmers, transformed an entire region. The transformation was not inevitable. It required specific conditions: the technology itself, the legal framework of the Homestead Act, the transportation infrastructure of railroads, the market demand for grain, the availability of immigrant labor, and the willingness of the federal government to dispossess native peoples and distribute their lands. All of these factors were necessary. None alone was sufficient. The sulky plow fit into this constellation as the tool that made the basic work of cultivation possible at the required pace and scale. Technology is never the whole story, but it is almost always part of the story. Understanding historical change requires attending to the tools people used and how those tools shaped what was possible. The sulky plow shaped what was possible on the Great Plains in the last quarter of the 19th century. It did not determine outcomes. It set boundaries and created opportunities. Within those boundaries and opportunities, tens of thousands of individuals made choices about whether to homestead, where to settle, how much land to claim, what crops to plant, and how hard to work. Those individual choices aggregated into the transformation we can measure in the statistics. 12 million acres cultivated in 1879. 103 million acres by 1929. Behind every acre of that expansion stands a person operating a plow, turning soil, breaking sod, making the future.